can't hear you, dude.
I'm not hearing you either.
Oh, God.
There we go.
All I can hear was.
Hear me now.
Yeah.
Hear you now.
Stupid microphone. We're talking about the stupid monster movies.
The Universal monster movies.
But first, for those who are uncultured and may not know who my guests are, introduce yourselves.
But yeah,
Well,
Jillian, you go first.
All right, I'm Jillian. I've been on the channel a handful of times talking about the Constitution, Disney movies, the production code, and the comics code.
Yeah, and I've been on here plenty of times, talking about numerous different topics. And yeah, and this time we're doing the Universal Monsters. Hey, Eddie. Hey, Daniel. And hey, Caden.
So Jillian, did the production code, or am I talking about, have anything to do with affect these movies at all?
These are mostly going to be pre-code. The later ones do fall under the code, and they did get affected by it. Not as severely as they would have under the comics code, where you weren't allowed to, have vampires. But the comics code got really intense for a decade or two.
I didn't know that in comics that they couldn't even have vampires.
They could not have vampires. They could not have all kinds of things.
That's absurd.
Basically, they drove the horror comics out of business and then loosened up the restrictions, which is when you start getting like Blade.
What do they have against vampires so much?
I mean, that's a really good question. They were against all of the monstrous stuff because the idea was that all comics had to be age appropriate for small children. So the horror comics, which were not age appropriate, because they were not intended for small children.
No. Wow. I mean, wow, look, I get it. There is a market for children, but there also is a market for adults too.
Well, not according to the guy who's basically the driving force behind the comics code. I have read his book, which, by the way, as from a pure scholarly perspective, is garbage. There's no bibliography, does not cite any sources. It's generally believed that the statements from children that he collected, he either made up or the kids were telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. I wrote a whole series about it a while back, and yeah, the comics code is some of the stuff in the movie production code, you're like, well, I kind of see what they're going for. The comics code is just garbage. It's basically juvenile delinquency causes, or juvenile delinquency is caused by comics, therefore, let's put a lot of restrictions on comics.
Wow.
Yeah, so one and all the Universal monsters would be forbidden from at least the first about 15, 20 years of the comics code. Under the production code, there were a whole lot of things they kind of had to imply more than show. One of the ones, which I assume we'll get to at some point, is Dracula's Daughter, which very carefully never says the word lesbian through its entire length. But really, really could.
So what got you, both of you, into these movies?
Well, for me, it was 20 years ago now. Makes me feel old to say this. It was back when Van Helsing came out. And back when Van Helsing came out, I remember I was at Costco with my family, and I remember at Costco they were selling the Universal Monsters Legacy Collection DVDs, and they were selling them basically as like a tie-in to Van Helsing. and I saw the Frankenstein one, and I asked my dad if we could buy it. Uh, since that, Van Helsing was coming out, and I thought that movie looked cool. And my dad misunderstood the concept of Van Helsing. He thought that it was about some guy who goes back in time to fight these, famous monsters. When that's not what the movie was about at all. So I don't know.
No.
Yeah, I did not know where he got that from. But anyways, so I asked my dad if I could buy the Frankenstein one. I remember that I fell in love with it. Then afterwards, naturally, I got into the rest: Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and the Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and yeah, and I remember me and my dad went to go watch Van Helsing in theaters, which was very shocking for my dad that he went to go see that movie. While yes, Van Helsing is more of an action movie than a horror movie, but it definitely has its horror elements to it.
Yeah.
Because of that, I'm really shocked that my dad went to go see that, because my parents have made it very clear that they don't like horror movies. So yeah, so yeah.
I had always known that they existed. I grew up in LA and I went to Universal Studios, like the theme park, a few times, which is at the original studio of Universal Studios. It started out as the studio tour. And back in the 80s, when I went a few times, you'd get, people wandering around dressed as the Universal monsters. And some of the original sound stages from these movies are still at the studio. So I knew that they existed, but I think the first time I saw any of them, about 20 years ago now, I started a project at my local library system where I was watching my way through their DVD collection in alphabetical order, watching everything that looked interesting. This took me about 11 or 12 years to finish up, and I skipped a lot of stuff. But coincidentally, I got the Frankenstein set, I think was the first one that I got, in October. So by sheer coincidence of the alphabet, I watched more than one of the Universal Monster movie sets for Halloween. And I didn't watch all of the movies in the sets because the quality drops off pretty steeply in the last few of any of the sequels. But I think I've seen at least one of every one of the classic series, and they are amazing, a lot of them. Though I have to say my favorite moment is Return of the Creature from... It's one of the later Creature of the Black Lagoon ones, where a young lab assistant, played by Clint Eastwood in one of his first movie roles, absent-mindedly puts a white rat into the pocket of his lab coat and just leaves it there for the rest of the scene.
I believe that the one that you're talking about is the Revenge of the...
Yeah, it's one of the later ones. I don't remember for sure. I just remember Clint Eastwood puts a rat in his pocket.
Yep. But yep, the one that you're talking about definitely is Revenge.
Yeah.
Before we get to the classic ones, you guys want to talk about the recent attempt to reboot the series a few years ago?
Oh, man.
Yeah, there was the Dark Universe, and that flopped.
Yep.
And again, making the same mistake Batman v Superman made, trying to focus on setting up a universe rather than the actual movie. It's like, look, I get it. Shared universes are in, and it can be argued that the universe of monsters actually was the first cinematic universe. But yeah, that Tom Cruise Mummy movie flopped, and then even before then, they tried with Dracula Untold,
Mhm.
and while that wasn't a huge flop, but it wasn't as big of a success as they were hoping. And Dracula Untold really wasn't a horror movie at all. It was more of like a fantasy action movie, and then they tried to remake The Wolfman in 2010, and that bombed.
Though I
And
have a perverse fondness for that movie. I'm not saying it's good, but I like it.
yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for it because that was the first R-rated movie like that I was able to buy a ticket for and to go see. And yeah, and that was my first time not having to rely on any sort of adult who would like to take me to go see it. And it seems to me the only success they've had is with the Brendan Fraser series of.
Yeah, the Brendan Fraser mummy movies are. I mean, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is its own conversation. But the first two Brendan Fraser movies are solid as hell. I would argue that they are better than the original.
Yeah, I think the only problem people had the Brendan Fraser ones was that terrible CGI of The Rock in the script.
Well, and there's a conversation to be had about the representation of actual Egyptians in that movie, which is capital N, not capital G, great. But the movies themselves are firing on all cylinders.
All right, I found this list on the IBDM.
IMDb, Internet Movie Database.
Yeah. Chronological Universal movies. And apparently the first one is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1913.
Yeah,
So yeah, from my understanding, I don't believe Universal Pictures ever did a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movie.
Then this list is completely inaccurate then.
Wouldn't surprise me.
But yeah, Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera, those ones had Lon Chaney Sr., who was known as the Man of a Thousand Faces. And but yeah, and from what I heard, the reason why that he became like as good of an actor that he was with his physical body language was because both of his parents were deaf. And then the only way for him to communicate with his parents was through his body language.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And he also designed his own makeup effects for those movies, and his makeup case is in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History.
Wow, that's pretty awesome.
Some of the makeup he used for Phantom in particular was extremely painful for him. He was using wire loops to hold his face a certain way, and it's a really good movie, and it's better the less you know about how he did it, because if you know too much, you spend all your time thinking about how much that must have hurt.
Yeah, because when I heard oh my gosh, even me doing this even hurts.
Yeah, but he used wire loops to hold his nose up.
I'm surprised that we never saw any blood coming out.
Yeah, no, he suffered for his art. There is a reason that he's still talked about today. He was a hell of an actor. I mean, very much in the stylized acting of the silent era, but nobody could convey emotion to the back of the house like Lon Chaney Sr. And in those days, makeup artist wasn't even its own job description.
Yeah, I mean, unlike, in the 30s and 40s and then so forth. Yeah, with Planet of the Apes and I know Planet of the Apes first came out in like the '60s, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, and it wasn't until Lon Chaney started doing these effects that people were like, "Hey, we could do that."
Yeah, and so pretty much Lon Chaney pretty much set the template like, for Planet of the Apes, Wizard of Oz, the Grinch with Jim Carrey, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the I would be shocked to discover that Guillermo del Toro is not a huge Lon Chaney fan.
Yeah, I
Because
mean, yeah,
the makeup and the look and the Del Toro Hellboy is all practical effects.
yeah.
So is this guy different spelling of the former vice president or the same?
Different spelling. It's Chaney.
Okay.
But yeah, and so crap, I just forgot what I was gonna say. Crap, I just forgot what I was gonna say. I am sorry.
I would actually argue that the Lon Chaney Hunchback and the Lon Chaney Phantom really launched horror as a genre. I mean, Hunchback is not really horror. Hunchback is complicated political machinations in medieval France. It's different, but having Lon Chaney in the role gives it a certain amount of horror simply because the makeup was so good. And Phantom of the Opera is unabashedly horror. I don't know if anyone else has ever read the book. The book is bonkers.
I never have read the book. I saw the movie like that had Gerald.
Oh, the Jared Butler. Don't get me started. I saw the Lloyd Webber Phantom of the Opera on the stage, and that was a great experience. And then I saw the Jared Butler Phantom of the Opera movie, and that was definitely a motion picture. They also really cheaped out on his makeup. He's supposed to be horrific. The character canonically does not have a nose. Jared Butler looks like he's got a bad sunburn.
Yikes! And then Lon Chaney actually was supposed to play Count Dracula in their movie adaptation, but then Lon Chaney died of like throat cancer, I believe, and so they were forced to find someone else, and Bela Lugosi was not their first choice, which probably because of Bela Lugosi was not a big name at that time, and they were wanting to have a big name since that they were investing millions of dollars into it, but Bela Lugosi persisted and persisted. He wrote to Universal saying, "You have got to cast me," and then ultimately Lugosi got what he wanted, but at a significantly reduced rate of only like $500.
Yeah. It also didn't help that Bella's English was not the best.
So what was $500 then can be now?
Oh gosh, I'd have to look it up.
I would have to look that up too because I don't know off the top of it.
Give me just a second. I actually keep a site bookmarked for just such eventualities. Because it comes up a lot.
That didn't sound good.
Did they like drop their phone or their microphone?
This we'll find out in a second.
But yeah, so anyways, and so Dracula with Bela Lugosi, that's from my understanding, it's argued to be like the first sound horror movie. And so Universal was started by Carl Laemmle. It was started by Carl Laemmle Jr. And Carl Sr. was not a fan of horror movies, but Carl Jr. was. And then ultimately, Carl Jr. got to have his way with horror movies by ultimately arguing that these do bring in a profit. And ultimately, the Universal Monster movies started in the 1930s. Well, really started in the 1930s. It was because of that was the age of the Great Depression. It was harder for people to find a job at that time. And ultimately, all these horror movies that Carl Jr. were was making was helping Universal Studios on the financial level. And then, afterwards they wanted to do Frankenstein, like to capitalize on the success of Dracula. And
See, have you heard of these three here? In the 4, 5, and 6?
Yeah.
Man Who Laughs, yeah.
Man Who Laughs is part of pop culture history, not so much for the movie itself, which I have seen and which is pretty good, but because the facial makeup of the main character inspired the look of the Joker.
Yep. And what's interesting is that The Man Who Laughs just became public domain back in January.
Yes. I do an annual public domain roundup of what's new in public domain. And
oh yeah, sorry.
that was one that got mentioned because that's a big deal.
It is, and especially with the big one with Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, no. I was like, yeah, okay, we're going to talk about Steamboat Willie because you have to talk about Steamboat Willie. Everyone's talking about it. Here's the details of how exactly Mickey Mouse is public domain and how he's not. Let's talk about the rest of the stuff now. Which I had done the same thing when Winnie the Pooh became public domain because it's only classic Winnie the Pooh. In the red shirt, he is still not public domain. That's a Walt Disney design.
Yep.
And won't be public domain for decades. So yeah, it works out to about $9,000. The 500 a week would be about 9,000 today, which would be a lot for me, but for the star of a big name movie, perhaps not so much. But it is true that the popularity of horror does tend to track with economic crises and political crises. You can also tell a lot about what is scaring people by what the horror looks like.
So far, have these all been silent movies still, or have they been sound yet?
Yeah, we're starting to hit 27 is when Jazz Singer was released. So we are in the crossover period at this point.
The next three and the last one, number 9, is someone I think we all know.
Yep,
yes.
Dracula. Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make. And that's my terrible attempt at doing a Lugosi impression. But hey, at least I tried.
What's most interesting about the filming of Dracula is that they filmed a Spanish language version on the same sets at night. So they did English during the day and Spanish at night on the same sets. And the woman who was Mina in the Spanish language version just died like a year or two ago.
Yep.
Like, she was 100 and change. She lived in Mexico. She was still going until very, very recently.
Yeah, I mean, she lived a long life. And, and I give her credit to that. I mean, a lot of people will say that the Spanish version of Dracula is actually better than the English version, but it's just the one thing that people say that the English version does better is that it has Lugosi, and then therefore a lot of people I met will say that they wish that Bela Lugosi actually was in the Spanish version.
Yeah, I don't know how he would have handled the language issues of being in the Spanish version. It's a phonetic language. He could have learned his lines.
Now with the public domain thing, does that start with the book of Dracula or the movie of Dracula?
Well, the book of Dracula has been public domain for a while, though interestingly, the first movie adaptation of Dracula totally, absolutely is not an adaptation of Dracula. We didn't get permission from Bram Stoker's widow, who wouldn't give it to us anyway, which is the classic German Nosferatu.
Yep. Nosferatu, yeah.
Which she actually got the rights to have all prints of that movie destroyed, and we're extremely lucky to have it.
Yeah, like, matter of fact, from what I heard, Universal actually had a copy of it, and in some scenes, you can tell that the 1931 movie actually was inspired in some parts, by Nosferatu.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we are extremely lucky by Universal and all these other people who had a copy that they were able to find a copy and preserve it, and that's why that in Nosferatu, that's why that they changed his name to Count Orlok, and they changed everyone else's name in the movie to try to avoid copyright. But from what I heard, there was a print of it that said freely adapted, like from Dracula. It's like, okay, then if you're trying to do all these mental gymnastics to try to avoid copyright, like with Dracula, whoever put that in was being entirely incompetent about it.
Yeah. I've seen the original. I've also seen the Klaus Kinski version from Klaus Kinski, Werner Herzog from the 70s. And it's Dracula. Like, even if they hadn't put that on the print, I don't think anyone watching Nosferatu would say, no, this is completely a separate work from Dracula. They have nothing in common.
Yeah, when they clearly do.
It's very obviously just Dracula in a funny hat. It actually has more in common with the book version of Dracula than the Bela Lugosi does.
Yeah, and that is a common criticism for the Bela Lugosi version. And look, I get where people are coming from, especially if you're a novelist purist, but there was a reason why Universal did it. It was more so for economic reasons. It was because it was cheaper, to do an adaptation of the play rather than of the novel, and it was just their way of being practical, with doing an adaptation of Dracula, but just whatever they could financially afford. And ultimately, if you can't afford it, then you shouldn't buy it, right?
Yeah, we have a question in chat.
So, no, copyright is still very much a thing.
It is.
The issue with public domain, and with movies, it's complicated. I do not pretend to understand the mid-century weirdness to do with copyright, which means that some movies are public domain and some aren't. There were changes in the law, and there was paperwork that had to be filed, and some people did and some people didn't. And there's a lot of mid-century shenanigans that means there are movies that are public domain, and I don't quite know why. But that being said, for a very long time, the Walt Disney Corporation, let's be clear, it was Disney, kept lobbying to have the length of copyright extended to keep Mickey Mouse out of the public domain. Actually, the last copyright bill, to tell you how long ago it was sponsored by Sonny Bono when he was still alive and a congressman.
Excuse me.
Sonny Bono, who perhaps himself had some interest in the field of copyright. For those unfamiliar, he used to perform with Cher. She got her start as half of Sonny and Cher. But Disney is basically, from what I can tell, going to fight the fight of trademark and has given up extending copyright because it was getting them really bad press, if you want my opinion.
Yeah.
I think that's why they caved.
Yeah, and also from what I've heard, um, I heard that Disney tried to extend the copyright even further than 95 years, but from what I heard, Congress was not for it. From what I heard, Congress was like, 95 years is plenty of time.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, and I'm totally with Congress on that. And in fact, would I have a whole bunch of reforms I'd like, which would include making it less than 95 years.
Yeah, because 95 years, it's like, look, I get it. All the companies and people who made these intellectual properties, they want to make money. I get it. You have to have money to survive, but 95 years, that's
Yeah,
really pushing it.
Like,
but you know who's on my side about a lot of the changes I want made to copyright?
Ooh,
One of Walt's granddaughters.
that's ironic.
She's not. She's like, no, our company, our family business screwed this up for everyone. Here's how it needs to be fixed. And I was like, people will listen to you and they will not listen to me. So
Yeah, and
didn't it used to be like something like so many years after their death, public domain?
yeah, and that's the thing is I get that that's hard to do for movies, books, plays, songs. That's all got a death of the author, but it's harder with movies because there are so many people involved. You need an actual number of years. 95 is too big a number of years.
it is.
But I forget which of the granddaughters it is, but she's like, look, we have enough money. We as a family, we have enough money. The company has enough money.
Well, I don't know. They've only bought Star Wars, Marvel, ESPN, and ABC and other stuff. I think they need more money.
Well, I do love that they traded an actual living person's contract in order to get Oswald the Lucky Rabbit back. That's really funny.
Yeah, and I mean, considering with how long it takes for copyright, because of that, as long as it stays that way,
Mm-hmm.
within our lifetime, we will never see a Sonic the Hedgehog horror movie. And like with like the current trend of turning public domain characters and turning into horror movies, I actually would love to see that. A Sonic the Hedgehog horror movie, but knowing how long it takes for for something to go public domain. I mean, Sonic the Hedgehog came out in 1991, the year before I was born, and and I'm either gonna be really old. I really hope I can make it to 99 years, but
I mean, I was in junior high going into high school in 91. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going into middle school, 91.
So yeah, I will certainly never, unless there are changes, which again, I would very much like, but hey, I will certainly never live to see Sonic the Hedgehog be a public domain character.
So at that rate, what year will Dinosaur Deniers be a public domain movie?
well, technically, Dinosaur Deniers is already public domain. It's because I never submitted it to copyright. So,
Well, George Romero never submitted Night of the Living Dead.
yep.
So-
And so therefore, because of that, that's why that movie became public domain. And I mean, heck, because that movie became public domain, you can argue that that's why anybody can make a zombie movie. And
Yeah.
when I say zombie movie, and now, yeah, there was White Zombie like with Bela Lugosi, but the zombies in that are not the zombies like that come to people's mind.
No, there's I Walked with a Zombie is in the 40s, I believe, and it's what if Jane Eyre but modern day and with traditional Haitian zombies. I highly recommend it. It's a great movie, but it is not the Romero, which, as I recall, the word zombie is never actually used in Night of the Living Dead. But it's not zombies the way modern audiences think of them. But it's great. It's atmospheric and creepy and black and white. It's very good, but not I walked with a zombie the way people think of zombies in the modern day.
And before you got on the next on the list, have you ever heard of number 7, number 8?
I think I've seen the Cat Creeps, but it's been a while.
I have heard of it, but I have never seen it.
I have not seen The Last Performance, but Conrad Veidt is a great actor, so I'm sure it's a good movie. Also, he was a really cool guy. I heard about him a while back.
All right. Number 10 is Dracula again.
Yes, that's the Spanish language one with Lupita Tovar.
And Carlos, I'm Villarreal, yeah, that sounds about right. And to be honest,
Barry Norton.
I feel like that the Spanish version, cinematography wise, it definitely has much better cinematography.
Yeah, I really need to watch it. I have not actually seen it, and I really need to.
It's amazing, and honestly, I'm surprised that even like with Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, I'm really surprised that there never was a Spanish version of that too.
Well, I have to say, Frankenstein is made by James Whale.
Oh yeah.
There's a movie about him, actually, co-starring Brendan Fraser.
Yep, ironic. And I know what movie you're talking about. It's Gods and Monsters.
Gods and Monsters. It's so good. With Sir Ian McKellen as James Whale in his old years. And it is very, very accurately the picture of a man whose career was kind of brushed under the rug because of his very open homosexuality. James Whale was extremely gay. And it does inform a lot of his horror movies. There's a lot in James Whale horror about outsiders and the fear of the unknown and, you know, things like that is very clearly, I was a gay artist in a lower class English town, in a lower class English household before World War One. Yeah.
So with Frankenstein, I know a lot of people get confused or think that, or the argument that it was the doctor, not the monster, was Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the monster is arguably the doctor's son, so...
Yeah, and what I feel like caused that confusion is that, especially back when Boris Karloff was in the Frankenstein movies at that time for Universal, they would slap his face, and then they'll put Frankenstein above his face, and then I feel like that's what caused the confusion. And then when they did Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and that, I think it's pretty clear that they were calling the monster Frankenstein, but hey,
yeah.
But they did it like for marketing purposes.
Yeah. Well, and the James Whale makeup design is so iconic.
It is, yeah. And which about that? So the Frankenstein book by Mary Shelley, that is public domain, and it even was public domain when they made the Karloff movie. But it's just in the book, the description of the monster is very vague. It says they have yellow skin and some other, and like
it's been a while since I've read it.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read it since I was in like the 4th grade, and that was 20 years ago now. But anyways, so that iconic look of the bolts on the neck, the flat head, that was not in the original book. So therefore, anybody legally can make a Frankenstein movie. But one of the ways how people got around the copyright was that they would change the scars and they would put the bolts on the forehead instead of the neck.
Well,
I mean, it is a clever way to get around it. But the original Karloff movie goes public domain in 2027. And so therefore, at that time, in 4 more years, people legally can have their Frankenstein monster look like the Karloff one. It's just there is a catch though. In the original Karloff movie, he only had that one clamp on his head. It was in all the movies afterwards, like was when he had more than one clamp, and so you just have to be very cautious to only have the one clamp on his iconic head. So
well, it's also worth noting that, and this is true with Dracula as well. There are a lot of things that are in the movie that have become how we think of Frankenstein that are not in the book.
Yep.
In the book, which is mostly first person, it's Dr. Frankenstein telling the story to someone. He's very clear. He's not going to tell you how he brought the monster to life. Because if you know, then you will try doing it. He knows how people work. And he doesn't want anyone to reproduce his experiment. So the whole bolt of lightning and all, that's from the movie. That is not in the book.
Yep, which is instantly like what comes to people's mind whenever they hear the name Frankenstein. They instantly think of the lightning.
Yeah. Igor is actually from one of the later Frankenstein movies. There isn't even an Igor in the first movie.
Nope.
There is an assistant. He's called Fritz.
Yep. And then Igor didn't show up until Son of Frankenstein, played by Bela Lugosi. And I believe in that movie, he wasn't even a hunchback.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen them, but yeah, it's the assistant character developed with the horror movies, and he doesn't even have an assistant in the book. He does it all himself. So
yeah, and from what I heard, the reason why that they added the assistant, it was in the play, like by Hamilton Dean, which is what the Karloff movie is based off of. So in the play, they wanted to have Dr. Frankenstein, like to have somebody like to bounce dialogue with.
Yeah,
and so ultimately that's why that the assistant like was created.
He needs an assistant, or else half the story's going to be monologue.
Well, two things real fast. One, back in the 2000s, I was watching a documentary or something, this history thing on the History Channel back when it was still history, about a thing called about the little Ice Age thing.
Yes,
and they said, and part of it says that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during the year of our summer.
Yes,
all in the winter thing.
Yeah, she was at some lake in Switzerland with her husband, poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's doctor / wannabe boyfriend / whatever the hell the guy was. And I think it was Percy Shelley had a dream about a woman with eyes for nipples. So it's worth noting there was probably a lot of opium involved in this. Let's be very, very clear. These were the wild kind of Victorians. And I believe Lord Byron it was either Lord Byron or Percy Shelley went screaming into the night. And then they decided that they were going to write horror stories. And Percy Shelley started something and never quite finished it. And I think Lord Byron did something that wasn't enormously great. And his doctor wrote a vampire story that was one of the ones that would go on to influence Bram Stoker. And Mary Shelley, who was a freaking teenager at the time, wrote Frankenstein. And basically invented science fiction horror.
Also, we have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is from Ghostwriter: which scene made you sad in one of the monster movies?
I would definitely say Bride of Frankenstein. It's that part. Yeah, it's that part with like the blind man. It's when the monster. finally finds a friend, and then he gets it taken away from him.
Yeah.
That part shatters my heart every single time.
The monster is a tragic figure. Similarly, I would say a Creature from the Black Lagoon. He also just wants love, and they take him away from his home and they put him in a tank in an aquarium. You know, I'm going to be mentioning Guillermo del Toro a lot. Shape of Water is basically, let the monster have the girl. Because he saw Creature from the Black Lagoon as a child and thought the ending was really messed up.
The next question is, which monster do you see as anti-heroes?
I mean, it could be argued that the Frankenstein monster is an anti-hero is because he's not a bad guy. He's just misunderstood. And he only acts violently because he's trying to defend himself.
Yeah. I would say more than anti-heroes, I think a lot of them are just purely tragic figures. Because they're not trying to accomplish anything. Most of the ones that I would say aren't villains, they just want to be left alone. You know, the monster, the creature, several of these other ones, even the Phantom of the Opera, to a certain extent, mostly just wants to be left alone. He just also wants to be left alone with a lot of money and the girl. But I think that more than anti-hero, what you get is classically defined tragic figure.
So, you guys, what about Murder in the Rue Morgue and The Old Dark House?
Yeah, so I finally saw The Old Dark House a while ago. It's on Tubi. But yeah, Boris Karloff, he got so badly typecast in that movie. I mean, It was the year after Frankenstein came out. He's pretty much playing the same character in that. And The Old Dark House, that really did set the tone for a lot of future horror movies to come with its concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a stacked cast.
It does, and one of them actually was Gloria Stewart, who would go on to play older Rose in Titanic.
Yes, indeed. Well, and Charles Lawton clearly learned a thing or two about filming from James Whale. He only ever directed one movie, but Night of the Hunter is kind of like, what if a monster movie where the monster is just some guy, but the filming style owes a lot to James Whale's style.
Oh yeah, definitely. And yeah, The Old Dark House, it's a great horror movie. While it never became as big as Frankenstein, it is still a great movie. And Murders in the Rue Morgue, that one is severely underrated. And it's a shame that one's not talked about more. But
I mean, the original story is one of the first detective stories, like, of modern fiction. That's Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, but yeah, instantly, whenever I hear Edgar Allan Poe, it's just the first thing that comes to my mind is that I instantly think of Poe's Law. And I can't help but think that if the whole term from Poe's Law, if that does come from Edgar Allan Poe, or if it's just a coincidence.
It's a coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, the first thing that comes to mind for me is a song from, I think it's You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. It's either that or Snoopy the Musical, where they're singing about homework. But yeah, those are both mostly forgotten today, but both very good.
And
Oh, yeah.
apparently Dracula played the guy in the Murder of the Rogue Morgue.
Yeah,
Bela Lugosi. And
Yeah.
and speaking of Lugosi, I actually had the fortune of interviewing Lynn Lugosi, who is the granddaughter of Bela Lugosi. I had her on my podcast, and I also had the fortune of getting Bela Jr. and Lynn like to sign a Dracula poster.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I also got Sarah Karloff on the same podcast, and I got Sarah Karloff like to sign my Frankenstein poster. And yeah, so and speaking of Bela Lugosi, as a Christmas present, I actually got this.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
And before we move on, we have two things from more. It says the villagers are evil for bothering Frankenstein.
Yes and no. Some of the places where they bother him, they're justified. Most of them, they are not.
And finally, why did Frankenstein have a bride?
Because he asked for one.
Ah.
It's in the book. He wants a bride. And as Stephen King points out in Danse Macabre, it clearly never occurred to Mary Shelley, because the bride is actually in the original book. And then gets destroyed, I believe, before she gets brought to life. But it clearly never occurred to Mary Shelley that someone with the knowledge of anatomy that Victor Frankenstein would have had to have had could have created a woman without a uterus. Because the reason he destroys her is so that they don't propagate and create a race of monsters. But it would have been trivially easy to create her and to make her infertile. But that's just not something that would have been a thing for a Victorian woman like Mary Shelley.
And finally, it says, and sometimes the movie version is considered superior to the book, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times people will say that the book is better than the movie, but now it has to do with Universal. But in the case of Jaws, the Jaws movie is a lot better than the Jaws book, primarily because the characters in the Jaws book are so unlikable. I mean, heck, even Spielberg himself even said that he wanted the shark to win in the Jaws book.
Yeah, I've never read the book because I've heard it's terrible. Likewise, I've never read the book of The Godfather because I've heard it's got some stuff that I wouldn't want to read.
I actually didn't know that The Godfather was based off of a book.
Yeah, Maria Puzo's The Godfather has this whole subplot that involves people's private parts fitting together. It's a whole thing. There's a lot there. And it got left out of the movie for some reason.
Yeah, the main thing I know about before we move on, the main thing I knew about the Jaws movie is it caused a lot of shark deaths after that.
Yeah, Peter Benchley later said that he really regretted the effect he had on worldwide shark populations.
Oh yeah, definitely. And now, well, look, I do get where he's coming from, but I don't think it was his fault. I think it was more so of the fault that people didn't understand that Jaws was just a movie.
Yeah.
All right. Next 3 or 4, starting with The Mummy. The first one, I think.
Yeah, the original. It's okay. It's not my favorite.
And Boris Karloff again.
Boris Karloff again. I have to say I like the Brendan Fraser better.
Yeah, I mean, it goes at a better pace, but what I will say is that first reveal of Boris Karloff as the mummy, excellently done.
Oh yeah, yeah.
How it
It's just
pans down
the
against
plot.
how the guy just laughs in a maniacal way, and then you see Karloff walking away. That is still excellently done.
Oh yeah, it's just the plot kind of drags.
Yeah, I definitely do agree, and that's the one that I watched the least amount as a kid.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and The Invisible Man, also by James Whale.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was supposed to star Boris Karloff, but for whatever reason, he didn't do it. And that's why it was Claude Rains instead. And Claude Rains, he was not that big of a star at that time, but for whatever reason, they made the exception and they cast him in it.
Was he the one that was invisible?
Yes.
The Invisible Man, yeah. Hey.
Yeah. That is another one based on a book that is, gosh, that's H.G. Wells.
It is, yeah. And the Invisible Man book is in the public domain. So honestly, I'm really surprised that not more people have made more Invisible Man movies.
I think the last one that was made that I'm aware of was Hollow Man with.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that Hollow Man has right is that the Invisible Man is a freaking psychopath.
He is.
Whether he was before he turned invisible is kind of up for debate, but in the book, he is a freaking psychopath.
Oh yeah, and there also was like the 2020 version, which actually was the very last movie I saw in theaters before all that chaos went on in the world in 2020.
I think the last movie I saw in theaters was also based on a public domain novel. However, that novel was Little Women, so very different. That's also Gloria Stewart, I would note.
Yes. But yeah, and but yeah, The Invisible Man, it's definitely a great movie. There is a lot of really great comedy.
Yes.
And especially at the part like where you just see him galloping in his pants and then he's singing that song, That's All Gathered. Nuts in Maine, nuts in Maine, nuts in Maine.
Yes.
Yeah, and for that being a movie that's almost 100 years old, the special effects are incredible.
Oh, the practical effects on that are amazing.
But hey, I think that my dog has to go out, so I will be right back.
Okay. Yes, the Invisible Man is more a psychopath than the monsters. The thing about the monsters is, almost without fail, the monsters are just trying to live their lives. There are some exceptions. Dracula's trying to live his life, but since his life involves draining the blood of the living, that's I'm not making an exception for him. He does not get to just live his life. But the Wolfman does not really want, he's under a curse. The monster did not ask to be brought to life. The creature did not ask to have the Black Lagoon invaded. Most of the monsters are just kind of living their lives until they are thrust into a situation where they become horrifying to humans.
Except maybe Dracula.
Again, except for Dracula. Dracula is planning to take over England with an army of the undead. That's its own thing. But most of the rest of the monsters are just trying to get by. The Invisible Man is a psychopath. He is enjoying what he can get out of being invisible.
Well, fast while we're waiting for Eric to return. Just want to say, if you haven't hit that subscribe and bell yet and that thumbs up, do so now. And be sure to leave a comment after this movie is done. After this podcast is done, and if you want to support the channel, there are links down below. I have merch, a Patreon, a Twitch channel you can subscribe to. Like I said, just share this video too. That'll help the almighty algorithm gods of YouTube.
Oh yes.
Like I said, merchandise. I have T-shirts, caps, and coffee mugs. So if you have the spare dime or two, feel free. But only if you have that spare dime. Don't go bankrupt, even for me. Commercial over with.
What I would say, the Invisible Man and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde have in common with Dr. Frankenstein, let's be clear, who honestly is the one I would say is the villain of Frankenstein. The moral of Frankenstein is take responsibility for your actions. Everything that goes wrong in that story goes wrong because Victor Frankenstein freaks out and runs away and doesn't deal with his own actions. But those three are all about science and where science can go wrong. In that way, they're more predecessors to, for example, the kaiju in, post-World War II Japan, where it's like, okay, nuclear war is bad and scary, and let's process our feelings. Yeah. The Brandon Fraser mummy is not really connected to these. It's kind of a bit of a remake of the 32 version of the mummy, but kind of not. Theoretically, it could be said to be set in the same universe, and it is a Universal movie, but it's not considered part of this classic series of them.
Yeah, well, real fast, when you said science can go wrong movies, don't let creationists hear you say that.
Yeah, well, I mean, science can go wrong. It's just a fact of life.
True.
And, Mary Shelley was living through a time of enormous scientific change. So was Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So was H.G. Wells. These are all people living through the 19th century, and the rate of invention was amazing in those days. And in fact, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote out Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and it's a very short book, to be clear, but he wrote it out in just like a couple of days, gave it to his wife to read. She freaked out and burned it, and he rewrote it. No, Dr. Jekyll does not have bipolar disorder. Dr. Jekyll, if anything, has dissociative identity disorder, but Dr. Jekyll created Mr. Hyde to go do all of the things that he couldn't do himself because he was a proper repressed Victorian gentleman. It is a treatise on your sins will find you out. You cannot hide from them.
Okay, so what else did I miss?
I was talking about how Frankenstein, Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde were all about scientific progress gone mad. And all three of the original books were written by people living through the wild inventions of the 19th century and talking about, well, this could go horribly wrong.
And what do you know? It does. It's because when you have a movie, if things don't go horribly wrong, it's gonna be a pretty boring movie.
Right, but I would say they're ancestral to kaiju, in as much as kaiju are about fear of science gone wrong.
Now, I'm guessing the Black Cat has nothing to do with the Spider-Man anti-hero.
No. I wouldn't have put it past Stan Lee to have named the Spider-Man character after the movie. But no, it's a weird little movie.
Okay,
so worth noting, these are all awfully short films.
Okay, so what movie are we talking about now? Are we
The
talking
Black
about
Cat.
The Black Cat.
Yeah, that's a movie I've heard of, and I believe I think that was the first movie that paired Karloff and
Yes.
Lugosi, in which there was that rumor going around saying that they hated each other, but that was really only a marketing thing. Yeah, like those two never hated each other in real life. I mean, considering that was something that I asked Sarah Karloff. I asked her, so is it true with the whole thing about the feud with your father and Bela Lugosi? And she was like, uh, yeah, like those two never hated each other. Those two like were cordial to each other, and those two like were friendly towards each other on set. But yet they lived very different lives and they had very different social circles. So
Yeah.
therefore, they really only interacted with each other while on set.
Yeah. Karloff was English. He was, slightly higher class in Hollywood. And Bela had actually turned down a few of the roles that Karloff ended up taking because he didn't want to be typecast.
Oh, that reminds me, we totally forgot about this. I can't believe that we forgot to talk about how Lugosi was supposed to play the Frankenstein monster in the 1931 movie, but he turned it down. And everyone says that is the biggest mistake of his entire life.
Yeah, he didn't want to be typecast, and you can't blame him.
No.
But he really shot his career in the foot, because they weren't doing anything else with him either. I consider Bela Lugosi a much more tragic figure than Dracula.
Yeah, and considering what happened to Lugosi afterwards, how he was in deep poverty and he was in deep drug addiction, which is why later on in Lugosi's career, that's why he did all those Ed Wood movies. It's because that he needed work.
Yep.
And ultimately, Ed Wood was the only one who was giving him work.
Yeah. And to be fair to Ed Wood, well, I think to a certain extent it was an exploitative relationship. I do think Ed Wood did personally like and admire him. It's just also, if he could cast a name, even if it was Bela Lugosi, he could get his movies made. And I think Ed Wood would have done anything to get his movies made.
So for the next three on the list, was Bride of Frankenstein the first movie sequel?
Bride of Frankenstein it wasn't the first movie sequel. There have been movie sequels for, pretty much as long as there have been movies, but it was the first sequel of this cycle.
Yeah, and people often say that it's better than the original, and people often say that it is the best out of all the Universal monster films.
Yes, I would agree with that, honestly. Elsa Lanchester, Charles Laughton's wife, in fact, in the spectacular dual role of the bride and Mary Shelley. This one has a framing device where Mary Shelley is talking about her own book, and she's played by Elsa Lanchester, who also came up under Disney because she is, among other things, the nanny who quits at the beginning of Mary Poppins. She did, I think, half a dozen movies for Disney, including the delightful Blackbeard's Ghost. I can't remember if I've seen Werewolf of London or not.
Yeah, Werewolf of London, from what I heard, that too was supposed to star Boris Karloff, but for whatever reason it didn't. And Jack Pierce did the makeup, but Jack Pierce was told that he had to tone down the look of the werewolf just so it could reveal more of Henry Hall. But then when Jack Pierce did the Wolfman, that was when he got more of his own say.
Yeah. if people are interested, everyone's got a werewolf character. If people are interested in the historical origins of a lot of the trope characters like werewolves, there's another YouTube channel called Overly Sarcastic Productions, and for Halloween, they've traditionally done let's talk about a specific monster. And her werewolf one goes back to ancient Greece to talk about the origins of werewolves. And it is fascinating stuff. Her Lovecraft one gets angrier and angrier at Lovecraft as it goes, and it's hilarious.
So yeah, and we were talking about public domain a while ago, and just so everyone has an understanding, anybody can legally make a werewolf movie, since that werewolves like are part of folklore and mythology. So anybody legally can.
Yeah.
It's just that you just can't call your werewolf Larry Talbot, and you won't be able to as long as copyright law stays within the 95-year term. It won't go public domain until, oh gosh, 95 years after 1941.
Oh, jeez.
I see. It's
I was promised there would be no math.
It's 35.
Yeah, like 2036, I believe.
Yeah. A lot of the specifics of modern werewolves do start coming from the movies. The concept of werewolves have changed so much that if you were to watch Werewolf of London and The Wolfman back to back, there would almost certainly, again, I don't remember if I've seen Werewolf of London or not, so I certainly don't remember details of it, but there would almost certainly be differences in how werewolf mythology worked in those two movies.
Now, Werewolf of London is different than a Werewolf in London.
Yeah, an American Werewolf in London, yes. Which I believe is directed by director/murderer John Landis. I'm sorry, he was acquitted. Shouldn't have been, but was. Very dangerously unsafe stunt on the set of the Twilight Zone movie killed 3 performers, 2 of whom were children who legally shouldn't have been on the set at the time anyway. So, yeah. And that's why Steven Spielberg doesn't speak to John Landis anymore. Because no movie is worth a human life, says Steven Spielberg.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, Raven, is that based on the Edgar Poe book, or totally different?
I think it's different. Frankly, there's not a lot to the poem of the Raven. There's a was American International Pictures, I believe.
Simba, come on. Simba,
movie of the Raven starring Vincent Price that has a plot that has nothing, or at least very little, to do with the poem, because the poem doesn't really give you a lot to hold on to. So it's possible, and I would have to look it up, but it's possible that they've used the title of the Raven to draw in people who think about Edgar Allan Poe, but it doesn't, there's nothing about surgeons or instruments of torture or young socialites in the original poem. There is a guy who is sad, and there's a raven, and that's the entire poem.
And also, this is also another meeting of Boris and Bella again.
Yes.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
So, speaking of monster movies, when you make your monster movie finally, is Simba going to be the monster in your movie?
Oh, definitely, yeah, because Simba would make such a scary monster. Roar! Roar! Oh, he's so fierce. Everybody fears Simba. Oh, gosh, isn't he the scariest monster who has ever lived?
Viewer discretion is advised now.
Oh, yeah, I mean, just look at those big floppity ears. It makes everybody shiver. Oh wait, I could call him Frankenbeagle.
Ooh, that's a good. That's a good. All right. Next three: Invisible Ray, Dracula's Daughter, and Night Key.
Never seen Invisible Ray, but I've heard of it. Never
Yeah, I
seen
haven't seen it either.
Another
Boris and Bella again.
Yeah, I saw Dracula's Daughter like last year or early this year, and yeah, Abigail that came out this year. It was supposed to be a remake of it, but not really a remake at all. Like there's a character in Abigail who Abigail's father is, who is it's implied like that he's Count Dracula, but they never say that he's Dracula. I feel like the Universal might have done that because of how Renfield bombed, Last Voyage of the Demeter bombed. So maybe that's why.
Yeah, I don't know.
But yeah, Dracula's Daughter, though. Interesting story about that movie. So when they made that movie, the Dracula book was not yet public domain. And so from what I heard, they didn't have the rights to a lot of the characters from the original Lugosi movie, but they really wanted to have Edward Van Sloan back. So that's why that he's called Von Helsing instead of Van Helsing.
Because it's totally different if you change one letter.
Yeah, and and they legally got away with that since that they never got sued.
So my first awareness of the existence of this movie came from I believe it was the documentary and not the book of the Celluloid Closet. They definitely feature clips from Dracula's Daughter in that, and oh boy, it is she's preying on young girls. That is what she is doing. She is one of the screen's earliest killer lesbians.
So, at least so far, Boris and Bela worked together way before Dracula meets Frankenstein.
Yes.
And now, the one thing that I agree is a problem with Dracula's Daughter, and if people agree with this, Lugosi should have been in it. And from what I heard, he was supposed to be in it, but he wasn't. And then that's why that there is like that wax replica of him instead, which is supposed to be him, but it's not him. It's just, it's just like a wax cast of him.
Yeah. It's a good movie. I would say of Dracula and Frankenstein, with both of those, I can heartily recommend the first and second movies. Diminishing returns from there, but the first and second of the Universal Dracula and the Universal Frankenstein are both worth watching.
Oh yeah, definitely. And Night Key, I've never seen that movie. Honestly,
No.
I've never even heard of it. So.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of it either.
Well, from the description of it, it sounds like a monster movie. It says an inventor of a new top-of-the-line burglar alarm system is kidnapped by a gang in order to get him to help commit robberies.
It's entirely possible it is a horror movie, but it does not at all look like a monster movie.
Yeah, definitely. So funny because I'm making a movie called Dracula versus the Frankenstein monster. And yeah, and Eddie, thanks for saying that about my dog. But yeah, well, I guess it depends on which incarnation you're talking about.
This is true. My gut instinct is for Dracula because he has powers and neither Frankenstein nor the monster does. But I'm just throwing that out there.
But yeah, again, it just depends on what incarnation you're talking.
Well, since Frankenstein's made up of human parts and stuff, if Dracula bit him, would that make him a vampire Frankenstein?
Yes. Um.
Well, it can be argued that the monster is a lot more powerful, so therefore he would have like the physical advantage. But yeah, Dracula also had the advantage, like to hypnotize people in the Lugosi movie.
And there's the shape shifting.
Yep, and there's the shape shifting, and you can argue that Dracula, when he turns into a werewolf, you can argue then that that's when he gets the physicality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is the bat thing of Dracula the movie thing or a book thing?
Yeah, definitely in the Lugosi movie, but I haven't read the book in 20 years. But I'm pretty sure that he turns into a bat in that too.
He turns into mist, I know. In theory, I'm following Dracula daily. In practice, I'm like weeks, if not months, behind on it. You can sign up to have. So Dracula, I don't know if people know this. Dracula is what's called an epistolary novel, which means that it's a series of letters and diary entries and things like that, and each one has a specific date. And if you go to I think it's DraculaDaily.com, you can sign up to have that day's installment of Dracula sent to your email inbox. And just read one day of story at a time. But I'm really behind. I haven't been reading it this year. So I don't remember if he ever turns into a bat. I know that he turns into mist, and I know that he controls wolves.
Alright, so the next three are the Phantom Creeps, the Son of Frankenstein, and the Tower of London.
Yeah, Phantom Creeps. Rob Zombie got inspired by one of the robots in this. When you see like that giant robot on stage at Rob Zombie's concerts, and even in some of his, I believe even in the super world of El Super Beasto, whatever it's called, it's the same robot in the Phantom Creeps that shows up there too. So
I technically have seen the Phantom Creeps, but I have to phrase it that way because of how I have seen the Phantom Creeps. It got made into an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, which, for the unfamiliar, MST3K started out on public access in Minnesota, was picked up by, at the time it was called the Comedy Channel, which merged with Ha to become Comedy Central, was on Comedy Central for a few years, got canceled there, was on the Sci-Fi Channel for a few years, got canceled there. They had a Kickstarter a few years back and were on Netflix, went 2 seasons on Netflix, got canceled there, and the creator of the show is sick of the whole thing, and now there's an app. Because he can't get canceled from his own damn app. And the premise is, it's a guy stuck in space with some robots, and they watch terrible movies and talk over them. Riff Tracks, which you may have also heard of, is a spin-off of Mystery Science Theater 3000. Everyone on Riff Tracks got their start on MST3K. So if I refer to having seen something with puppets in the corner, the robots are puppets. So I have seen the Phantom Creeps with puppets in the corner. But that's the only way I can recommend watching it, because it's not good, kids.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, so Phantom Creeps, going back to what we're talking about, that is public domain, and I tried putting it on my YouTube channel, but I got blocked for copyright. And I'm like, that shouldn't have gone blocked, because that is public domain.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's one of the ones that got into the weird mid-century public domain. I am not a copyright lawyer.
I'm not either, so.
I know that some really good movies and some really bad ones both got caught in that whole thing, which is why I once watched all of To Kill a Mockingbird inside a video game. Because To Kill a Mockingbird is public domain.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Because of weird mid-century public domain shenanigans.
Huh.
So the son of Frankenstein, that's the son of the doctor, not the son of the monster, right?
Yes.
Yes. One of the only times where they got the name Frankenstein right.
Yes. I've seen it. It's Boris Karloff, Basil Rathbone, and Bela Lugosi, so there's that.
Yep, and Basil Rathbone is was mostly known for playing Sherlock Holmes.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, when I put the Sherlock Holmes Basil Rathbone movies on my channel, because those are public domain, my channel exploded. And so therefore, people, if you want to get views fast on your channel, upload the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films.
Those are some weird movies. You get Sherlock Holmes fighting Nazis because why not?
Yeah.
And it looks like Tower of London is based upon Richard III of England.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one and really should, because I find him a fascinating historical figure. And it turns out we have the same medical condition.
That would be...
Adolescent onset scoliosis.
Never heard of that.
Well, scoliosis is a crooked spine, which, that's how everyone thinks of Richard III. Well, when they found his body a few years ago, they found his skeleton in a parking lot in England a few years ago. How they determined it was his, I actually don't know, but they did somehow. And it turns out that, yes, he did have a hunchback, and it was caused by adolescent onset scoliosis, which I have.
So he's apparently the monster in this movie because at least according to people, he murdered his nephews.
Yeah, there's a lot about that. I tend to lean towards the fact that he didn't do it. I tend to lean towards it was Henry VII, but that's a whole big... It's never going to be resolved. But yeah,
well, I don't know. Either way, either they died in 83 or they were hidden away in 83 and murdered in 85 when Henry VII came. But for a while, they were just out of the picture for a long time.
Yeah. And we may have found their skeletons, but we may not have. And there's some... Apparently, Charles is much more willing to let people investigate the skeletons than his mother was, so that it may actually get resolved if that's the prince's skeletons. And I look forward to more information about that, but I have not actually seen Tower of London.
If you want to know more about that, check out my video about the War of the Roses and Henry VII.
Is that Bede?
Yeah.
Which way did they come down?
I forget. It was like 3 or 4 years ago.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I have the whole 3-part series, starting with Edward III to the whole War of the Roses, because Edward III was the father of all the people, and then finally ending with Henry VII, the guy that quote ended the War of the Roses by marrying the other side.
Yeah, and then executing pretty much all of the rival claimants.
But next 3. Invisible Man Returns, Black Friday, Mummy's Hand, and Invisible Woman.
Yeah, we're starting to get heavy into the sequels here.
We are, yeah. Invisible Man Returns. I believe that this was one of the first Vincent Price.
Yeah.
And I saw it a year ago. Honestly, it's besides Vincent Price, it's pretty forgettable.
Yeah, Vincent Price was many things, but I never saw him in anything where he was forgettable. But the movie around him frequently is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And yeah, Invisible Man Returns. The movie itself was forgettable, but not but not him though.
He was a fascinating figure.
Oh, definitely. And even his daughter, Victoria Price, she seems like a very fascinating
Yeah.
individual. Like how she's an inspirational speaker,
Mm-hmm.
and how originally she didn't want to do horror cons because she was like, oh, what do I have in common with them? And then ultimately, that was when she realized that what she has in common with them is the love of her father.
Yeah. I actually have one of his cookbooks somewhere.
Wait. Vincent Price had a
Vincent Price, yeah. He wrote several of them, and I bought one at a used bookstore because it was funny to me. It was a cookbook by Vincent and Mary Price, and I was like, oh, haha, Vincent Price. And I was like, oh, no, it's actually, oh, okay. He was a gourmet.
I never knew that about Vincent.
Yeah, gourmet and art collector Vincent Price.
Well, I mean, whatever worked for him, right?
Yeah,
Vincent Price wrote a cookbook?
several of them. Yeah.
How am I just now hearing about this?
I don't know, but it's one of the more interesting things about him is that, you know, he had this public image, and then there was this deep, rich, varied person that most people knew nothing about. And, you know, he'd go and be spooky on camera, and then he'd go home and make, like, coq au vin or whatever. I've not seen Black Friday.
But the plot sounds familiar about putting someone else's brain in someone else's body if they're that person or the person of the brain thing.
Yeah, I've seen 4 or 5 movies with that one.
So with the title Black Friday, is it just a coincidence, like about with the Black Friday thing after Thanksgiving, or?
Black Friday was called that originally. Contrary to popular belief, it is not about economics. It's about cops, and I want to say it was Philadelphia, called it that because policing the sales was such a nightmare.
So it sounds like that the title of this is just a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, and also, you know, a lot of days through history have been called Black Friday because they are Fridays where bad things happened. You know, the 1929 stock market crash would have been probably what most people would have thought of in that's 1940. So most people, I think, in 1940, hearing Black Friday, were more likely to think stock market than shopping.
Yeah, like I said, I've that plot's been in several movies. Like,
yeah, there's a bunch of movies called Black Friday.
Like, are you the brain? Are you the person? Is the brain who the person is now, or is it the body?
Yeah. I've seen that plot before. I've seen that title before. I don't think I've seen that combination of plot and title before.
And then The Mummy's Hand.
Saw it once a long time ago when I was a kid. The only thing that I remember was all of the scenes where the mummy slowly is chasing after people, which people often argue. People often that was one of like. People often argue that these mummy sequels were like the early slasher movies, like in the case like how the villain slowly would go after them when it should be easy, like to just escape them.
So is that where they got the character from the Addams Family?
What Thing?
Yeah,
Possibly. I mean, I don't know if Thing was invented by Charles Addams or by the makers of the TV show. I haven't read enough of the comics to be sure.
All right.
The Invisible Woman. What if an invisible man, but a woman?
Yeah, and from what I heard, there was going to be a remake with Elizabeth Banks, but that never happened.
Was
Yeah,
she as crazy as the when
John
the man
Barrymore.
did it, or was she more sane? Or
Man-Made Monster, I never heard of that one.
Man-Made Monster looks like What If Frankenstein, but with a different name and Lon Chaney Jr., frankly.
the son of the guy from the earlier in the movies?
Yes. He inherited a lot of his father's training. Like, his father taught him a lot of things. His career was not as good, but I would argue that he was not in a good time to be in classic horror films, and also he lived a lot longer. So it's easy to say, oh, well, Lon Chaney Sr. made nothing but classics. Well, yeah, but also, his Hollywood career was so much shorter.
And Horror Island.
Never heard of that one.
No, never heard of that one either.
All right, then moving on. The Black Cat again.
Yep.
Oh, wait, sorry. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen I think I've seen the Black Cat, but I think it was a long time ago.
This is a different one than the one we saw earlier.
Yeah, I don't remember. I've seen at least one movie called The Black Cat, but it was a long time ago, and I don't remember which one.
Yeah, I think that one on the list is a remake of the earlier one, but
it might well be. But yeah.
But the Wolfman though, I've definitely seen that one.
Yes.
Is it a sequel to the Werewolf in London?
No,
or different.
No.
I mean, I can see why, because it's a werewolf movie and done by Universal. But no, it's not a sequel.
Yeah, no. A lot of these movies are not even really connected to one another. Obviously, the Frankenstein movies are all theoretically in the same universe, and the Dracula movies are all theoretically in the same universe, and all of that. But the concept of an overarching, universal cinematic universe was not, I think, something that was really an idea people had in those days.
And next, finally, The Ghost of Frankenstein,
which was the first Frankenstein movie to not have Boris Karloff. It's because that Boris Karloff decided, and I know this because of when I talked to Sarah Karloff. Boris Karloff decided he didn't want to do it anymore after Son of Frankenstein. He said he decided to not do it again because he didn't like where the storyline was going and with the physicality to it. He just felt like it was time to move on. And so that's why they got Lon Chaney Jr. instead, who was fresh off of the Wolfman. So yeah, it was definitely for marketing purposes why they got Lon Chaney Jr. And interesting, Lon Chaney Jr. is the only actor to have played every single one of the Universal monster movie. He played the Frankenstein monster, he played Dracula, he played the Mummy. But he didn't play the creature from the Black Lagoon. It's because that was like a whole decade after. So
yeah, now we are getting into the start of World War II.
Yeah, and the movies start getting silly at this point, because war era escapism was a thing.
So yeah, basically, it was just to keep up with the times. And the Invisible Agent, I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
Yeah, I think it's in the collection, and I went, no, I'm good.
Says Invisible. It says the Invisible Man's grandson uses his secret formula to spy on Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I wonder where they got that plot from.
I mean, it has Peter Lorre, but he did a wide array of really bad movies. So,
Yeah, Night Monster, never heard of that one. The
no.
Mummy's Tomb, yeah, I saw that one back when I was a kid.
And finally, we have our first crossover.
Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Yeah,
I've seen it.
so Lon Chaney was supposed to play both monsters in it, but then the studio decided it just wasn't practical to have that, and so that's why they got Bela Lugosi, which made sense to have Bela Lugosi as the monster because it's redemption after he turned the role down, and B, at the end of Ghost of Frankenstein, the monster does switch brains, like with Igor, who was played by Bela Lugosi, and in this, when I interviewed Lynn Lugosi, the Frankenstein monster was supposed to have dialogue, but it was cut because of how audiences laughed at the dialogue. And so the reason why the monster, does that with its
Mm-hmm.
part, which is so stereotyped for the monster, actually comes from this movie. And the reason why he does that in this movie because he's supposed to be blind.
Huh.
So it makes sense. But it just sucks that Bela Lugosi's dialogue was cut, especially because back then there was no such thing as DVD or home video. So once they cut it, it was cut. And sadly, that footage is lost.
Yeah, probably recycled for the silver.
Yeah, so because of that, we more than likely will never see it. And that really sucks.
Captive Wild Woman.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. No.
It's got John Carradine, which I have to tell you is not a sign of quality.
This is an insane scientist doing experiments on glandular research becomes obsessed with transforming a female gorilla into a human, even if it costs human lives.
Interesting we mentioned John Carradine, because John Carradine would go on to play Dracula and House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. And then in the 1970s, when like an independent film studio was doing Dracula versus Frankenstein, they originally wanted John Carradine, but the problem was John Carradine's agents were asking for more money than what they had. So that's why they got Xander Borkov instead. And yeah, John Carradine, he had an extensive career, like in doing movies. I mean, say what you want about him as an actor, but he did a lot of movies.
I have seen a lot of John Carradine movies, most of which with puppets in the corner.
Sounds like you're not a fan of him.
I mean, I have no problem with John Carradine. I think mostly he got into the career path of doing terrible movies. And that happened to better actors than him.
And then we have another reboot of Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, well, and I believe this is the first sound version of Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
Which sound is kind of important to Phantom of the Opera, logically speaking.
Yep.
Because it's opera?
Because opera. And they were... Nelson Eddy had done a whole series of movies with a woman named Jeanette MacDonald in the 30s, where they did all these romances where they sang, and they were trying to make Susanna Foster the new Jeanette MacDonald. And Phantom of the Opera was supposed to launch her career, and it did not.
Ouch.
All right. Next ones are Dracula, Nagul, and Culling Dr. Death.
I believe Son of Dracula is where we introduce Count Alucard.
Yep, which is a very common trait throughout like the rest of Dracula media after this. But yeah, Lon Chaney Jr. People, including myself, agree he was miscast.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fine movie, but Lon Chaney Jr. as Dracula, miscast.
Yeah. I think I've heard of the Mad Ghoul. I can't remember if I've seen it or not. I have not seen Calling Dr. Death.
Never seen the Mad Ghoul. Never seen Calling Doctor. I've never even heard of Calling.
I don't think I've heard of Calling Dr. Death either. It sounds like it could be interesting, but given when it falls in the series, probably isn't. This was not a good time for Universal monster movies.
Yeah, because that's when they were starting to dwindle in quality.
Yeah.
Was this code starting to affect them at this point or not?
Well, the code had been affecting them for quite some time. There was a lot that they were not able to show.
Okay.
But the issue with a lot of these was more the scripts are bad.
So that reminds me, which is worse, a bad script or a bad director? Or
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
like can a good director fix it? Not like a fix, but override a bad script, or can a bad director like hurt a good script?
I think it's easier for a good director to override a bad script than it is for a good script to override a bad director. I have seen both of them done. Honestly, I happen to like the Les Miserables musical from a few years ago with Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe and so forth, but the direction on that movie, and particularly the cinematography choices, it's just not well done. But it's the musical of Les Mis. It's hard to go wrong with that script-wise, but you spend an awful lot of that movie looking at people's nostrils. You know, it's clear that he does not know what to do with the camera while people are singing. And he doesn't know how to tell them to move and things like that. And so that is a good script with a bad director.
What vice versa?
Good director with bad script. I think a lot of early movies by good directors end up being good directors with bad scripts. You go looking in Roger Corman. He hired some really great names in what would go on to be Hollywood. Francis Ford Coppola worked for him. Ron Howard, who has made bad movies, but I think is a perfectly adequate workman-like director. But he got his start working for Roger Corman. You know, early movies by a lot of directors are bad movies because the scripts are awful. But you can see that the director really knows what they're doing.
Yeah, the same can be said with director and actors. I know several actors that are good that were good in the past, but they have one bad director and their role sucks.
Yeah. Well, also I think there are a lot of actors who are what I call stay in your lane actors. And that can be a real problem too.
Is that the same as typecasting?
No, because typecasting is somebody who could do other things but isn't allowed to. Whereas stay in your lane is, it shows when you're doing what you're not very good at. John Wayne. When John Wayne was in his lane, he was doing great work. When he wasn't in his lane, he was playing Genghis Khan. And I have seen that movie, and it's just as bad as everyone says. But when he was in a movie where he got to play, the strong, silent hero, or even the strong, silent, anti-hero, as in Stagecoach, he was doing really good work. But he had to be playing the right role, and if he wasn't playing the right role, then he was not giving a good performance. Whereas you get, there are performers who, Karloff could give good performances that weren't these same monster movies over and over and over, but he didn't get the chance because he was typecast. That is the distinction to me. Weird Woman, Jungle Woman, The Invisible Man's Revenge. The Invisible Man's Revenge is arguably the plot of the first movie. He doesn't deserve revenge, but that's not the point.
Wouldn't the revenge be from the people, his victims, not him?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I had stopped watching the movies in the set by the time we got to Invisible Man's Revenge. And given that the director is Ford Beatty, who I've seen a bunch of his movies, guess how, I chose not to watch The Invisible Man's Revenge. It's also worth noting that the biggest name on a lot of these tends to be Lon Chaney Jr., and some of them don't even have a name that big. So this is really the drag years for Universal.
Are most of the people fighting the war at this point?
Well, this is 44, so a lot of Hollywood was fighting the war, but there were also a lot of people who were 4F, or there was a point system. You earned enough points and you could go home, or had been wounded and went home, or were too old. Well, yeah, but Eddie, that Frankenstein being able to hold Dracula in place relies on him being able to be doing that at the right time of day. Also, Dracula can turn into mist, at least in the book. It's notoriously hard to hold mist. John Wayne got himself declared an essential worker, vital to the public interest to stay in Hollywood. Clark Gable went to war, but I am actually convinced that was a suicide attempt on Clark Gable's part. He had gotten married during the filming of Gone with the Wind, which is, we're talking 38, 39. The movie came out in 39. I don't remember exactly what his wedding day was, though. He got married. He was deeply, deeply in love with his wife. She was an actress named Carol Lombard, and she was on tour selling war bonds. And she persuaded some soldiers to let her take their place on a flight. The plane crashed, and she was killed. And Clark Gable, I believe, enlisted the next day. In the Air Force, he was on a bomber crew, as I recall.
I didn't know the Air Force was a thing in World War II.
Yeah. It was technically the Army Air Force still at the time, but it was the first war where there was a designated, you could sign up to be in the Air Force in the U.S. military.
Okay.
And if you were drafted, you went into the branch of service that they told you. But if you signed up before you were drafted, you got to choose which branch of the service you went into. So a lot of men signed up to be in the Air Force or in the Navy because then they didn't have to be infantry in the Army.
So, like, if you enlisted, you can pick what you want to do. If you're drafted, you're out of luck.
Yeah. And I mean, to a certain extent, even enlisting, you didn't get to pick fully because, you could enlist to be in the Air Force and then, end up as a mechanic or a cook or, whatever instead of the pilot that you wanted to be, but at least you weren't a foot soldier. So a lot of people signed up to have a little bit more freedom in what they wanted to do. And Clark Gable signed up to be in the Air Force. He and James Stewart were both on bomber crews and both became war heroes during the war. But with Clark Gable, I'm utterly convinced he just didn't want to live without Carol.
Welcome back, Eric.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, I could tell that my dog was getting hungry, so I put food in his bowl. So
we were talking about the effect of World War II on these movies.
Oh yeah, I mean, World War II had an effect on movies. That's for sure. I mean, even 9/11 did too. I mean, every movie that took place in New York, was forced to censor out the Twin Towers. A good example is that the original Spider-Man, like with Tobey Maguire.
Yes.
There was supposed to be a scene like how Spider-Man traps these bad guys with like webs and like the Twin Towers.
Trapped a helicopter between the towers of the Twin Tower.
Yep. But then because of 9/11, understandably so, they cut that. I mean, heck, even in a poster, you see like the Twin Towers reflected on Spider-Man's eye. But rightfully so, they censored that out.
They even had to edit Lilo and Stitch during that time.
Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, heck, even with the Sandy Hook shooting and the movie theater shooting, like there was a movie called Gangster Squad, like that was supposed to have like a movie theater shooting, but they changed that to a shooting somewhere else. I don't remember where, but I can see that. And so, it goes to show that all these events that go on in the world, it can impact movies because it can impact them on a financial level. Because like for Spider-Man, if they would have kept in that stuff with the Twin Towers, people would have took issue with that, which then meant that they would have lost money.
Yeah. Well, specifically what we were talking here was, a lot of the actors in Hollywood went to war. There was a definite change in cast during the early to mid 40s, simply because, you can't film with Clark Gable. Clark Gable's in a bomber somewhere over Europe. And so there were a lot of people who became stars during World War II simply because they were there. Gregory Peck, I don't remember exactly why he was in Hollywood at the time he was, but he got started in the tail end of World War II. He happened to be able to be in movies and still be relatively young and relatively attractive.
So, yeah, Jillian talked about these three. What you, Eric? These three have any impact on you?
Do I have any? What? Sorry.
Weird Woman, Jungle Woman, The Invisible Man's Revenge. Opinions?
Never seen any of them.
All right, moving on. The Mummy's Ghost, The Climax, and Dead Man's Eyes.
Climax, Dead Man's Eyes. Never seen. Mummy's Ghost, I saw that when I was a kid. Again, only thing that I remember were all the mummy scenes, and from what I heard, Lon Chaney Jr. hated playing the mummy. He hated it so much, like that he had like a hidden beer tube going into his mouth, and so yeah, so Lon Chaney Jr. played the mummy while intoxicated.
Yeah. And Lon Chaney Jr. and John Carradine, again, we're not talking sign of quality here. No offense to either man. Both of them were talented, but both of them made a whole lot of bad movies.
Oh, also, also while you're gone, we also talked about the difference between being typecasted and staying in your lane, actors.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I do get it, wanting to break away from being typecast, but I
Some
mean,
some people
whenever,
who were typecast should have just stayed in their lanes.
yeah, and I mean, ultimately, whatever will help to put food on
Yeah,
whatever will help to put food on the table.
yeah. I gave John Wayne as my example of a stay in his lane actor. When John Wayne was playing the right role, you could get a good performance out of him. When John Wayne was playing the wrong role, you get the conqueror, which I have seen. The screenwriter had Marlon Brando in mind. That's not a movie that's going to work with John Wayne in the lead. But yeah, I have heard of The Mummy's Ghost. I have not seen any of these.
But yeah, honestly, there's not much to say about the Mummy's Ghost.
It looks like all of the Mummy movies basically have the same plot.
Yeah, I mean, change maybe like a few minor things, but
The House of Frankenstein, the Mummy's Curse, and the Frozen Ghost.
so yeah, House of Frankenstein, they got Boris Karloff back, not as the monster, but as a mad scientist. It's a decent movie, but it has some problems. Dracula's introduced early on in the movie, and then he gets killed early on in the movie, and that's disappointing. And the Frankenstein monster doesn't come alive until like the very end. So therefore, it's disappointing with how they jumbled up all of the monsters in it. Like, it's a great idea to have all the monsters in it. It just could have been executed better. And but yeah, it was supposed to include the mummy, but the mummy got cut more so because of economic reasons. So
The Mummy in Louisiana, apparently.
Sure, why not? I mean, I can explain why not, and it's all to do with climate, but, you know. Louisiana's going to rehydrate your mummy pretty quickly.
so Jillian, have you ever seen the House of?
I have not.
Okay, so therefore I'm the only one here who's seen it. But yeah, Boris Karloff did an incredible job with the movie with his character. Like, his character really is the one like who will double cross people, and he's the one, like, basically, like, for argument's sakes, if he were to make a promise to the Invisible Man, he would make the Invisible Man like become visible at the worst possible time. Like, he's one of those kind of he's one of those like kind of characters. Which is what made Boris Karloff's character in House of Frankenstein such an interesting character. And yeah, the Mummy's Curse. I believe that was the one where it's supposed to take place in the 1990s. But I mean, to be fair, back in the 40s, there was no way that they would have known how the 90s were going to be like.
Yeah.
It's just funny because the 1990s in that movie, so obviously the 1940s, and yeah, and I mean, to be fair, there was no way that they would have known that floppy disks would have been a thing or anything else.
Yeah, it's the way the future looks is always wrong.
Yeah, like how I heard back in 2000 there were supposed to be cars like that can fly, and from what I heard, some people actually did try that,
You,
but
you can get flying cars, but they are actually a bad idea. So,
and why would they be a bad idea?
well, for one thing, you still need the wingspan of a plane in order to make your car fly. So what you're basically dealing with is something that's bad at two things. You've got to be able to remove the wings, which means you've got to figure out where you're going to put the wings. You have to be trained to fly. You need runway to take off. And if your flying car stops working, it falls out of the sky, which is generally considered bad.
Yeah,
And
fair.
it would have to follow flight path, so it's not actually superior to just having an airplane, except in as much as you get to drive it away from the airport.
Fair, yeah.
Yeah, the logistics of flying planes, or flying cars rather, are something I've thought about and have realized we don't actually want that.
No. But yeah, that's something that we will only see in the movies.
Yes.
And finally, the Frozen Ghost.
Never even heard of it.
I have issues with that title because ghosts are non corporeal. So how do you freeze them?
I mean, that's movie logic for you.
Bad horror movie at that.
The Jungle Captive, never heard of that one.
Never heard of it. Strange Confession, never heard of. House of Dracula, I've heard of. Have
But
not
yeah,
seen.
Strange confession. You know, I have an awfully strange confession that I have never seen it.
Yeah.
There's a scientist who is working for a cure for the flu, is victimized by a singular boss who releases the vaccine before it is ready.
And it doesn't star Jenny McCarthy. Yeah, never heard of it. Have heard of House of Dracula, have not seen it.
Is that that different or the sequel to the House of Frankenstein?
It is, yeah. It's pretty much just a rehash of House of Frankenstein. And I guess one good thing about it is that Lon Chaney Jr. gets a happy ending at the end. But yeah, but Dracula in the movie, he wants to find a cure for his vampirism because I guess he's tired of being a vampire.
I mean, no pun intended, but there are some ways being a vampire would really suck.
Yeah. Yeah, like knowing that you would live forever and you would have to see all of your loved ones die.
Mm-hmm. And if you've got any kind of conscience, the whole blood sucking thing, unless that's why you get versions where vampires can live on like animal blood. But if it's strictly human, that gets complicated.
I think they got around that in the Buffy series by making them demon possessed humans.
Yeah.
No conscience at all in that fiction. All right. Pills of Death, House of Horrors, The Brute Man, and The She-Wolf of London.
Pillow of Death.
I saw She-Wolf of London as a kid, and I thought it was dumb. And even the title, She-Wolf of London, is a stupid name. And even when I told my dad about it, even my dad was like, that is a stupid title.
Pillow of Death is stupider.
Pillow of Death?
Pillow of Death. Number 56. Pillow of Death.
Never even heard of.
Neither have I, but I think it's going to be our stupidest title. I have seen The Brute Man. Guess how?
How?
Puppets in the corner.
Yep, that makes sense.
It's not good.
A madman, House of Horrors. An successful sculptor saves a madman named the Creeper from drowning.
It looks like there's a bit of wish fulfillment in that one, since he sends the guy after his critics. Oh, June Lockhart's in She-Wolf of London. She would go on to be lost in space.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, this one looks interesting. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
That is a classic. And
There is actually a review of that movie in one of the issues of my school newspaper from my senior year in high school, because one of the people in our journalism class wanted to review something no one had ever heard of, and we owned Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He loved it.
And apparently the next one, they used their full name.
Yeah. Interesting bit about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi played vampires multiple times throughout his career, but he only played Dracula in film twice. And this is the only time, like, when Bela Lugosi reprised his iconic role. And it also would be his last time working for a major film studio, because afterwards he only did independent films.
Yeah.
Now, were they playing themselves in this movie, or are they playing different people?
Abbott and Costello always played characters, but they were characters that everybody knew were just Abbott and Costello.
They confused Frankenstein by doing the baseball skit.
Yeah. Who's in the crypt?
So, Invisible Man. Before they meet Frankenstein, then they meet the Invisible Man.
Yeah.
That one is hilarious.
That's one.
Especially at that scene, like, where one of them is in, like, a boxing ring, and the Invisible Man is there helping him. But it's funny considering that you can't see the Invisible Man, and then here's this guy and he comes up, and like when one of them isn't even punching him. So yeah, and so that just makes it hilarious.
They do something like that with Blackbeard's Ghost. The Disney movie from the 70s.
So I can't help but wonder, like, if they got inspired by this, or if it's just a coincidence.
Almost certainly got inspired by it. There are bits from that movie where, yeah, it's clear what they're borrowing from. But it's a fun movie, and I love it, so who cares?
And finally, The Strange Door.
No, I haven't heard of it.
Right.
Charles Lawton, though.
The Black Castle came from outer space, and Abbott and Costello again meets Dr. Jekyll and Hyde.
Never seen that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of these.
All right. Now we get to one you have heard of, I'm sure of.
Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh, yeah.
Probably my favorite of the Universal monsters.
And out of curiosity, what makes that one your favorite?
For one thing, the underwater photography is outstanding. It's the best filming after James Whale.
Oh yeah, definitely.
The man who played the monster was really good. It's got an environmental message, and that amuses me for a movie from 1954.
Yeah, and ultimately that's why Universal did this movie, is because at this time, sci-fi monster movies were really, really popular at that time.
Yeah.
And so then this was basically their way to compete.
Yeah.
All that.
This is getting into the giant bug era.
Yep.
I like Creature from the Black Lagoon. Revenge of the Creature is also good. This Island Earth is the movie from Mystery Science Theater 3000, the movie, which was their theatrical release effort.
So, Revenge of the Creature is a sequel.
Yes.
To Black Lagoon.
Yes.
They didn't say Black Lagoon. It says Revenge of the Creature. You guess what it means, I guess.
Creature's mad because it wants to go back to the Black Lagoon.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, the creature's a very sympathetic character. It's because it's the humans like to come into his world, and then one of them even throws a cigarette into into its own home.
Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately, that would be just like saying that if you left home and then you came home and then you saw people like were having a party like in your own home, how would you feel? And what's interesting about Creature from the Black Lagoon, all of them are public domain, but Creature from the Black Lagoon isn't.
Yeah, because it was created for Universal.
Yep. While you can argue that some aspects are in the public domain, like a half human, half amphibian character is in the public domain, but the Gillman specifically isn't.
Yeah. You could get away with a lot, just ask Mike Mignola and Guillermo del Toro, but that specific creature is the only one of these that is actually owned by the studio.
Yep, and that's why that when Monster Squad was made, that was not done by Universal. It was done by TriStar. TriStar even was able to get away with having the Gillman, but they made significantly changes. How it has a much more menacing look, with like those piranha like teeth and yeah, and if you haven't seen the Monster Squad, the Gillman in that looks way different
Yeah.
than it did in the Universal movies, but that's because of copyright.
Yeah. This island Earth is it's aliens. And they want humans to come and figure out how to save their planet, but it's too late. Excuse me, and their planet is doomed.
The next one, Abbott and Costello Return.
Yeah. I believe that's kind of the tail end of Abbott and Costello because they weren't getting along so well by then.
And why were they not getting along so well then?
I don't remember, honestly. I think part of it was part of the shtick was, and I can never remember which is which, so forgive me on this one. But one of them was always the dumb one, and the other one was always mean to him, and that kind of started to bleed into their private life, as I understand it. And it had just been, they'd been working together for a long time, and I think there was some burnout going, too.
Well, I mean, I can see why, considering that if you do the same thing so much, it eventually will get tiring.
Yeah, they'd been working together since, I believe, the 30s. And this is 55, and it was just, and they're, chasing monsters around the soundstage, and it just, they were done.
Next one's about
being chased by in a Scooby-Doo sort of way.
And next one is a giant spider.
Tarantula. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
I don't think I've seen other giant bug movies, but I have not seen that one.
The only one I've ever seen was the Eight-Legged Freak starring the early Scarlett Johansson.
Johansson,
yeah.
I can wholeheartedly recommend them! ! Which is giant ants. Really outstanding cast. including, and I know this because I know the guy or knew back, many years ago, the guy personally, a man named Richard Bellis, who would go on to write the music for the miniseries of Stephen King's It, and a lot of theme park music for the Disney parks.
That's the one that came out recently, not the 90s one.
No, the 90s one.
Okay.
I knew him at the time. His dad founded the camp that I used to go to, and he missed camp one year because he was writing the music for it. Every time there's something where the title is a pronoun that comes out that Mr. Bellis isn't involved in, I'm a little disappointed. Because he was in them and he wrote the music for it. I've never heard of Cult of the Cobra.
Never have either. But yeah, the creature walks among us. That one's interesting because that's the one like where the creature gets burnt, and then the only way to save it is if they turn it more human-like.
Yeah.
It's like, I do get it that they didn't want to make the same movie over and over again. But yeah,
I would say it's the best of the third movies about one of the classic Universal monsters. But I would also say that's kind of a low bar.
yeah.
Like, it's better than Son of Frankenstein.
So this is one of the good trilogies?
Yeah. Creature Walks Among Us is definitely the worst of the series, but it's still not terrible. I've heard of the Mole People, but I don't think I've seen it.
Yeah.
Oh, Hugh Beaumont.
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. So,
but you've heard of the actor, then?
Hugh Beaumont, I believe, is the dad from Leave It to Beaver. He's some TV dad or another, but I'm pretty sure he's Mr. Cleaver.
Let me look it up real fast.
Seen a lot of his movies with puppets in the corner. Yep.
but yeah, a lot of people,
Mr. Cleaver.
Yeah, a lot of people argue that The Creature Walks Among Us is the last of the Universal monster movies.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they did make horror movies afterwards, yes, but The Creature Walks Among Us is regarded as one of the last of the Universal monster.
The classic series?
Yeah.
Let's see what else real fast.
The Deadly Mantis I've seen with puppets in the corner.
The monolith monsters, no, never seen that.
Never heard of it.
Monster on the campus, never heard of it. The thing that couldn't
die is a good title, or the thing that couldn't die. Yeah, I think I have seen that with puppets in the corner.
Yeah, of course, the Brendan Fraser mummy. I've seen that, and
yeah, we skipped from 58 to 79.
Yeah, the Frank Langella Dracula is pretty good.
Yeah, it is. That one again is more based off of the play, just like with the Lugosi movie. So you can't argue that the Frank Langella Dracula is a remake of the Lugosi Dracula.
Yeah.
So we have I don't know. Let's time there's a 10-year gap between the monster thing that couldn't die and Dracula, and another 20-year gap between Dracula and the Brendan Fraser mummy.
Yeah, we got a couple of serious gaps in there, and that's because Universal couldn't make horror movies as cheap as they were being made by the independent studios. And they weren't making, high quality monster movies at that point. They were making cheap ones. But you can't out cheap Roger Corman or Burt I. Gordon or, those guys. The ones where the monster is a dog with carpet scraps attached to it. Or, people in hefty bags or whatever. So Universal stopped making monster movies.
So would 78 Dracula be the first modern monster movie then?
Well, so there never stopped being monster movies.
Yeah.
And so saying when the first one was, because the thing is Werner Herzog's Nosferatu came out at about the same time as the Frank Langella Dracula. In a weird kind of symmetry, the originals and the remakes both came out at very, very similar times.
Well, what would you consider modern movies, in your opinion?
Well, that's the thing, is I have a really hard time defining that. I would say that... Well, I would say that modern is a movable date. And so what I consider modern today might not necessarily be the same thing I would have considered modern if you asked me 10 years ago.
Like some people say, I guess some kids say will consider music that we grew up in the 90s to be classic music now or something.
Yes, because they want to make me crumble into dust.
NSYNC, a classic band.
Jesus Christ. If I were going to use modern as a term with a set era attached to it, I would probably say it was after the start of the rating system. And by that standard, yes, absolutely, Dracula, at least for Universal, was the first modern horror movie.
But like I said, definitely a 20-year gap here to the...
Yeah.
And we're no longer classic. Now we are in the...
Yeah, the Mummy Returns. I actually remember when that movie came out, there was so much hype about it. And from what I heard, the Brendan Fraser Mummy, it was supposed to be more like a horror movie, like how the Karloff movie was. But then Stephen Sommers came in like with his pitch, how it's like Indiana Jones. So therefore, it got a bigger budget. And
speaking of crumbling into dust, my personal standard for classic says that it has to be at least 25 years old. The Mummy Returns came out the year that I graduated from college and is within a few years of being considered a classic by my standards.
Wow. And and then Van Helsing, funny, like how I mentioned that earlier in the stream, saying how that was what got me into the Universal monster movies.
Yeah, whereas I had already seen at least one or two of these movies by then.
Now, apparently they don't have the Scorpion King as monster movie.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually seen the Scorpion King because
I was wondering, since it's in the same universe as the Mummy movies, obviously.
It is, yeah.
Frankly, I didn't see it because it didn't have Brendan Fraser.
Yeah, and there were a ton of sequels to the Scorpion King. None of them had Dwayne Johnson.
No, because they couldn't afford him anymore. Well, and because he could do things that were not that, and my God, if you could, wouldn't you? I saw Van Helsing in the theater.
I also did.
There's one or two really good scenes in that movie, and then there's the rest of that movie.
I will admit, Richard Roxburgh as Dracula, he overacted.
Oh, yeah. The scene
overacted.
The scene I really like is the ballroom scene. The rest of the movie, I may have injured myself laughing when that coach burst into flames.
So is this before he became typecasted as Wolverine?
Oh, this is after the first X-Men movie came out.
Okay.
And I believe after X-Men 2 came out.
I believe so, yeah. But no, The first X-Men movie came out the summer of 2000.
All right. So
And then X-Men 3 came out in 2006, which was 2 years after Van Helsing. And yeah, what I remember about Van Helsing is that I remember for Christmas, I remember that year that I got like the entire Dracula or Frankenstein castle playset, like with like
Mhm.
the other characters. And so sorry, it's just Van Helsing brings back a lot of childhood memories.
And that's fine, but
Now I will admit, nostalgia aside, the movie still has its flaws. Like how I mentioned, Richard Roxburgh overacted as Dracula. The CGI isn't the best.
no.
and we have
Um,
we have the last four. on this
okay,
list.
so the Wolfman. First off, that's a great cast. Second, Joe Johnston. Pretty sure is the guy who did like the Rocketeer and Captain America: The First Avenger, and is a very, very talented director of period pieces. And the choice to make it a period piece is, I think, what saves the movie from being much, much worse than it could be, even if it is one of two movies that came out that year where somebody ends up in the Victorian era Thames because they're trying to make all of the skin crawl off my body. Because that came out the same year as Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr.
Yep,
And he also ends up in the Thames.
yeah, and now one good thing to say about the Wolfman is the makeup effects were incredible.
Yeah.
It was faithful to the Lon Chaney Jr. version, but it also updated it, and rightfully so. The Wolfman remake actually did win an Oscar, like for best makeup effects.
Yeah. And I think that it really got. I mean, there's some weird stuff to that movie, and I haven't seen it in a while, but it really got into what can be done well with the pathos of the character. Because the Wolfman is. I keep going back to it. The Wolfman's a tragic figure as he is portrayed in the Universal movies. He does not want to be a Wolfman. And the Benicio del Toro version is really not happy about how things are going in his life. Let's see here.
The difference between the Wolfman and Dracula is, at least in the daylight, the Wolfman can pretend to be a regular human.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Rick Baker did the makeup on it.
Which is perfect because Rick Baker said that it was the Universal monster movies that inspired him to do what he does. And then when he heard that they were doing a remake of the Wolfman, Rick begged Universal like for them to have him do it. And then from what I heard, Universal said that he was the only one like who they wanted to even do the makeup in the first place.
Also, fun fact, his first ever Oscar was 1981 for An American Werewolf in London.
So he won an Oscar twice for a werewolf.
And then in 94, he won for Ed Wood.
Also having to do with
Right. The
Universal.
man has a pedigree, is what I'm saying here.
So was the new Mummy movie not Universal? It's not, or was it? It's on this list.
I think it's just not on that list.
Okay.
I mean, we can still talk about it, and we can still talk about the 2020 Invisible Man. And
I was never going to see the new Mummy movie. Like, regardless of anything to do with it, I don't watch Tom Cruise movies.
well, and I mean, I saw the Tom Cruise Mummy in theaters, and wasn't that very good. And honestly, you didn't really miss much because there
have been very few movies that I've regretted not seeing since I started my Tom Cruise boycott.
Yeah, and Dracula Untold, I saw that in theaters. Did you see that one?
I have not.
It was okay. It was more of a superhero movie, and I get it because Marvel was really popular at that time, but it was pretty forgettable. But yeah, the 2020 Invisible Man. Did you see that one?
I did not.
I did, and I loved it. That one totally made up for the Tom Cruise Invisible Man because these movies are not action movies. These are horror movies, and that's what worked for the Invisible Man is that they went back to these being horror movies, and from what I heard, they're also going to remake the Wolfman yet again.
Sure. If it's come out in the last 10 years or so and I can't watch it with my kids, chances are pretty good I haven't seen it yet.
And how old are your kids?
My son is 11 and my daughter is 7.
So yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how you feel about your kids watching horror movies.
They don't really like them.
So yeah, so then in that case, that wouldn't appeal to them anyway.
Yeah. I watch more while they're in school these days, and I'm slowly catching up with all the stuff that I need to see. But the list of movies I need to see never gets any shorter, no matter how many movies I watch.
Yeah, Eddie, I get it where you're coming from about remakes, but we have to remember at the end of the day, it is a business, and they have bills to pay for too.
And it is also worth noting that the James Whale Frankenstein is a remake. There is a silent movie version of Frankenstein that predates the Karloff.
Yes, it's from 1910, and it stars Charles Ogle as the monster. It's very short, and yeah, and the monster in that is made from like magic rather than science.
Sure. I don't have an inherent problem with remakes. What I have a problem with is remakes that don't have anything new to bring. Some of my favorite movies actually are remakes. I'd rather watch the Coens version of True Grit, for example. But I will also agree that the vast majority of remakes don't have anything new to bring.
Yeah, like a lot of the live action Disney remakes are just beat for beat the same movie, changing a few things here and there, but the same movie.
Oh yeah, and I've just stopped watching those.
I did too. I mean, I saw the Little Mermaid remake in theaters. Well, not as bad as the Lion King remake, but still pretty bad.
Yeah, I think the last one I watched was The Jungle Book.
Yeah, like I said, the reason I didn't see the Little Mermaid wasn't because of the Black Mermaid. It was because of Disney movies suck in general at that point.
Yeah,
it's because I have a moral problem with the live action remakes as a whole. Because they are, deliberately not paying the scriptwriters of the original because they don't have to, because they're putting a lot of money into these things that do not need to exist instead of, creating new properties. Or even, my hot take, remake the bad ones. Like, I would go see a remake of The Black Hole if they made it better than the original, which is a low bar. But I'm not going to see a remake of The Lion King because I can just watch the original, which is really good.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I'm talking about remakes. I think personally, Lion King was bad too, but I think of all the remakes I think one of the worst ones that I've heard of is Mulan.
Oh yeah, Mulan I am given to understand is not just bad, but also extremely racist.
And it's funny, like how they cut out Mushu so it could appeal to the Chinese market, but yet the movie wasn't a hit in China anyway.
Mm-hmm.
They gave her superpowers.
Yeah.
So pretty much they ruined her character arc.
Yes.
So, anyways, like I said, I'm back. I was trying to close the the share screen, but apparently I just left the whole thing somehow.
Yeah, it'll happen. You're a professional.
Yes, but I don't have a drink. I don't have a drink for that. Like, so we're continuing if you want to or not. But what's coming up on your channels that you want to advertise?
Well, let's see. I had something go live this morning about, gosh, what was this morning's article? Now I have to look because I actually genuinely cannot remember my own article.
You know, put the link in the chat. Feel free to.
Yeah.
Right. While we're waiting, Eric, what's going to happen on your channel?
Yeah, for me, the third Things That Piss Me Off movie, a few episodes of Let's Watch a Movie. I'm going out of town soon for a networking event to meet other filmmakers. And I'm going to be doing a live stream there with the 406 boys. So.
Oh, right. Okay. I have something coming up called Celebrating... I had something come live today called Celebrating the Problematic, which is about how to talk about talented people who perhaps have things that make them not someone you necessarily want to give a wholehearted recommendation for. Because, I don't know about you, but when Shannon Doherty died, I thought, oh, I heard she was really hard to work with on set. And so I didn't want to write an obituary about her because that seems like something that's kind of rude to say.
Yeah, I can see that.
Shannon Doherty, she was really hard to work with on set. Or like when Stan Lee died. I was like, oh, yes. So I wrote today about how you talk about these people.
As for me, I'm continuing my finally edited and upload video games I've been working on forever, and finally got around to doing them, uploading them. And then Saturday, I'll be interviewing someone who did a whole YouTube series about the Power Rangers.
Do.
Yeah, he pretty much turned a fan fiction into a whole 100-episode series on YouTube.
Interesting.
Yeah, he is an on-screen character that reviews Power Rangers shows while being attacked by bad guys. But so of all these, at least of the classic ones, what's your bronze, silver, and gold medal monster movie?
My personal favorite would have to be the Boris Karloff Frankenstein, considering that that's the one that I have the most childhood nostalgia for.
Is that your gold medal or your bronze medal?
Probably my gold one. Silver one probably have to be Creature from the Black Lagoon. And bronze, probably the original Wolfman.
So my bronze is probably Dracula, though I do still need to see the Spanish language version, which will probably
do it.
Yeah. Silver is Bride of Frankenstein. And gold is Creature.
Oh yeah, and about Creature, there actually was supposed to be a remake by John Carpenter in the 1980s, but that got canceled. Oh man, imagine how awesome that would have been.
The thing is I'm not actually a huge horror person, but I do love a lot of these classic Universal monster movies because they're just so well done, and one of the only, by the standards we've given, modern horror movies I really like is Halloween. I thought was very, very well done.
Which one?
The original, like Jamie Lee Curtis and
Nick
well,
Castle.
I do wish they'd
Donald
sucked it
Pleasant.
up and set it in California because it was so obviously California.
If you want to see more
It
about
was.
that, check out me and Eric's review of the Halloween multiverse.
With all the love in my heart, it's not just that I went to high school like a mile and a half away from where they filmed that lets me recognize that that is not the Midwest.
Yeah, that was not Illinois, especially
No.
with the palm trees.
No, it is South Pasadena, California. I know literally I have been on some of those streets.
So Jillian, of all the timelines of the Halloween, what's your favorite timeline?
So I've only ever seen the first one. Because again, I'm not really a horror person. I saw the first one when I was doing the Great Library Project. It started with H, so I watched it.
And
Yeah, I did not realize
why.
when we were reviewing this series, I did not realize like that one movie split like 3 or 4 different timelines off.
Yeah. Like horror just part of the issue is I'm almost never scared by movies. The only time I remember being scared by a movie, I was very young. We're talking like 2nd grade young. And my local library did films in the library on Friday afternoons. Because I'm old enough that it was a projector. And we watched an adaptation of the Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. And I remember almost nothing about it except the end credits involved this bug crawling through like undergrowth. And I remember being abjectly terrified. And that is all I remember, and it's the only time I remember being scared by a movie. So, if you're not scared by movies, horror kind of loses a lot of its draw. And so many horror movies are so bad that I don't want to,
Yeah, I have the opposite problem. I'm too jumpy in real life situations, so I don't know.
Fair.
If someone comes up with me and I guess it's from my time of being bullied in school. I'm just like, twitching.
Yeah. Well, if I get told that it's a quality movie that I would enjoy, for its quality as a movie, I will watch it. But I don't generally sit and watch horror movies because I don't get out of them what you're expected to get out of them.
What about you, Eric? When you get out, what's your opinion on horror movies?
For me, I definitely do like the adrenaline rush, which is why that I watch horror movies. But hey, I get it. It's a genre that doesn't appeal to everybody. And I mean, at the end of the day, you can't please everybody.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people have a hard time accepting, there is a market for horror movies. And I mean, just because you don't like it, it doesn't mean that there's not a market for it. And ultimately, for all of these people like who hate horror movies, then that means that they're not the target market for it.
And that doesn't mean that horror movies are satanic.
No, I mean it just means
think.
that they're not the target market. I mean the same thing can even be said about marijuana. Like there are people who are hardcore anti-marijuana, but at the end of the day, there is a market for it. I mean, you go to the store and you'll see marijuana merchandise.
Speaking of horror things, I was getting an idea. What do you guys think about for a future project talking about Disney sequels?
Yeah.
Some of them are good. Some of the, there is one live action Disney sequel that Walt approved of because Walt himself personally didn't like sequels. Oh yeah, I haven't seen much of any of the direct-to-video ones.
I've seen Lion King 2. I saw Little Mermaid and Lady and the Tramp 2 back when I was a kid. A lot of them I haven't seen since I was a kid. So
I saw Aladdin 2, one of my favorite sequels.
I've seen Lion King 1.5. I've seen Kronk's New Groove, and I think that might be it.
Well, we can figure out and schedule a time then if we want to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. But anyways, we're almost 3 hours in.
Yep. So you guys want to say your closing catchphrases?
Do you want to know what pisses me off?
I don't really have a closing catchphrase.
Okay then. I'll see you all Saturday. But in the meantime, never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. Bye.
Later.
Bye.
Trust me, well, I went